It's time to bring in our friend Richard Falkenrath. Richard was a Homeland Security advisor in the Bush White House. He was also Deputy Commissioner for Counterterrorism at the New York City Police Department. He's now a principal at the Chertoff Group and a contributing editor here at Bloomberg. Richard, welcome. This must be an extraordinary day for you. You were in the Bush White House during the hunt for Osama bin Laden after the September 11th attacks. Try to put it in perspective for us. There's a lot of high-fiving going on, a lot of congratulatory emotion, but the war on terror does not end right now, does it?
No, it doesn't, but I think people do feel quite relieved today. This took a very long time, and there was a growing sense of frustration in the country at large and inside the community that, like, why is this taking so long? 10 years have passed since this attack. This manhunt has been going on, so people are very relieved to finally have gotten this done. The intelligence community deserves a lot of credit here because they were the ones who really put the clues together to track him down and find him hiding in the suburbs of the Pakistani capital.
What does this mean for U.S.-Pakistani relations? We know that for a long time, right, Pakistan has said, we don't know where he is. Yes. And I know there's a little bit of confusion in a way about the joint statements. I mean, the U.S. says it acted alone. The ISI said that Pakistani forces helped.
Yes, and he was right under everyone's nose, right in a suburb of the capital.
An affluent suburb,
It's
right?
as if he was in Chevy Chase, Maryland, from the White House in downtown Washington. This will be a big deal in U.S.-Pakistani relations. In part, the Pakistani elite was really getting sort of sick of the United States intervening in its own internal affairs, and there had been a rupture in the last couple months between the CIA and the ISI in terms of some of the covert activity that the CIA was carrying out. I'm sure that the Pakistanis will now raise this and say, okay, you've got your man, he's taken care of, get out of our country, leave us alone. And the U.S. is going to take the position, as you suggest, we still have problems in your country where we don't want to go. But I have no doubt that the Pakistanis will be using this as a way to encourage the U.S. to lower its profile.
It sounds like what you're saying is actually the relationship could get more tense.
Yes, it's going to get more tense in some ways. I mean, on the one hand, they probably did. My guess is if you bring a helicopter all the way in from Afghanistan to the capital of a country, that someone in their military establishment must have been witting of the operation because it's been so dangerous.
But hang on a second. Must have been witting to the idea that these helicopters were going to go in and take out Osama bin Laden, or that the U.S. had identified a high-value target, perhaps, someone they weren't willing to name, because given what we've known previously, Richard, surely if they had known that Osama bin Laden was going to be taken out, somebody might have tried to give him a heads up.
Yeah, they would have given a heads up, and he would have disappeared out into somewhere, the wilderness, wherever. It's possible, Eric, and we may never know the answer to this, and this is admittedly speculation, but it's a very dangerous thing to fly a helicopter hundreds of miles through an airspace of a country with a real air defense system. Much of it sold to it by U.S. defense contractors. So, it's possible they went in and totally black, never telling them, but it's risky.
We are back with Bloomberg contributing editor Richard Falkenrath. He's a former deputy Homeland Security advisor in the Bush White House, also the chief counterterrorism point person for New York City, principal at the Chertoff Group. We were just listening, Richard, to what Lara was telling us about who is in charge of al-Qaeda. How important is that? I assume it's everything for the U.S. war on terror.
Well, we don't think Osama bin Laden has played a very active role in directing operations in the last 4 or 5 years. He had been a recluse. He'd separated himself from contact with the outside world to a very large degree. He was a symbolic figure, the sort of head of the organization, but he wasn't controlling the operations. He has a deputy, al-Zawahiri, who's an Egyptian, who is a sort of an ideologue, who apparently is still alive and still active, somewhat more operationally involved. The number 3 position in al-Qaeda, the head of operations, is typically, they don't live very long. They live maybe a year or two before we find them and they end up getting captured or killed. So this organization is significantly degraded over the last decade, and Lara's analysis is basically right, that this has metastasized from a centrally directed organization that spanned the globe to lots of little more regional and national organizations that carry out attacks spontaneously under a kind of symbolic rubric of support from al-Qaeda.
So does that make it much harder, Richard, for U.S. and other Western security operations to anticipate al-Qaeda's next move? Might it be a backlash of some sort, retaliation, retribution from any number of different places?
Yes, it does make it much more difficult. It's easier when you know where your enemy is and what they're up to and what their basic modus operandi is, then when you're dealing with essentially dozens of different small cells spread all over the world that carry out things more or less spontaneously. The attacks that we're likely to see are probably going to be less sophisticated, less catastrophic in character, but harder to counter.
Maybe for a few years, or do you think that's a permanent trend?
Well, it's hard to predict that far out in the future, but certainly another global organization would need to coalesce somewhere in the world. To do that, they either need a very complacent United States, and hopefully we won't become complacent again, as we were in the 80s and 90s, or they need a sanctuary that protects them, that allows them to carry out these operations.
So, Richard, from your perspective, is it perhaps, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is it a mistake to think of this as a reduction in risk? But by what you're saying, it almost sounds, if anything, is in the short and medium term, risk might actually be going up, and that the measures airports and other key pieces of infrastructure take are going to make transit, commerce much more difficult.
I think the risk that we face from terrorism is basically unchanged as a result of this. Now, clearly, this is a good thing. I mean, we needed to wrap up and get closure on the events of 9/11, but I do not believe that it leads to a significant lessening of the terrorist risk we face.
We are rejoined right now by Bloomberg contributing editor Richard Falkenrath. He is Deputy Homeland Security Advisor in the Bush White House. He is now principal with the Chertoff Group. Richard, you and I and Erik spoke earlier about this idea that perhaps relationship between U.S. and Pakistan is going to be more tense. You said that is certainly a possibility. But from an egocentric point of view, what does this mean for U.S. citizens? I mean, we know there's a travel advisory. Does it mean that we're going to go back every time we travel to the airports and back to post 9/11 where, I mean, it just takes hours and it's really slow travel?
Well, there's a travel advisory out right now as a result of this. It's basically done out of an abundance of caution. I think there won't be much change for the average citizen as you move around the country or around the world in the sort of security regime that you have to go through. If we see a new threat emerge, if there's some new tactics that come along, if there's a new series of attacks, then yes, there will be adaptation. But killing bin Laden in and of itself is mostly a feel-good experience for American to get some closure on a decade after having been attacked on 9/11, and to have some confidence in our intelligence community and our military to carry out something they've been trying to do for 9 years.
Richard, let's take it back to the region right now, because Harris Anwar was just telling us about the response in Pakistan. What about Afghanistan, right? It was the Taliban that gave Osama bin Laden shelter in the first place and allowed him to plan the 9/11 attacks. Clearly, much has changed there. There's going to be new leadership. But in terms of policy implications, what does Osama bin Laden's death mean there?
This could create it could worsen a dilemma for President Obama. So President Obama has intensified U.S. military operations in Afghanistan. The Taliban controls about a third of the country right now. But we have, nearly 150,000 U.S. troops and well over $100 billion per year spent in these military operations. Bin Laden and al-Qaeda was the one part of this that everyone agreed on, that we should be going after them. The rest of it is highly controversial, and in fact the American public now does not strongly support this war, and I think a majority of the American public say it's not worth the cost anymore. This is a really serious problem for President Obama because he has doubled down on a bet that President Bush started and needs to prevail. He cannot have a loss of this war on his record. Yet the one cause for these military operations, al-Qaeda, that everyone agrees on is now, to a certain extent, taken off the table.
And unlike with bin Laden, you can't just take out one person in Afghanistan and declare victory.
Not even close. It's a completely different sort of objective and requirement in terms of what the military must do.
We are back right now with Bloomberg contributing editor Richard Falkenrath. Richard, we've been speaking about the implications of Osama bin Laden's death. One interesting thing is there was actually live tweeting from an IT consultant in the mountains who actually saw the helicopters, but it just points out how much media and live news and this ability to tweet maybe now is even more of a security threat than not. I mean, what if al-Qaeda had picked up on that person's tweets?
Yeah, this is a remarkable transcript. And I think one of the things that Special Operations Command in Tampa they will be looking at is how do we jam these things in future? Because we would ordinarily jam shortwave radio, but now you might actually have to jam geolocated tweeting and social media sorts of transmissions.
I mean, because he was giving a play-by-play, essentially. I mean, innocently enough, he was just like, oh, there's a helicopter and it's kind of annoying me because I'm trying to do some reading.
Exactly. I mean, it's a remarkable, in police operations, it's actually now gotten to the point where you do watch Twitter to find out where the demonstrators are going, to keep control of unruly crowds. It may be now that the military has to look at that too.
But that said, with 10 seconds to go, Richard, the lockdown on this was pretty good. No word of it leaked out into the very, very last minute.
They did a great job. And this bin Laden intelligence had always been kept in an extremely tight channel. They handled that part real well.
Richard, thanks very much. Richard Falkenrath here with us.